Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I'm Sharon Azara, the course coordinator, the program coordinator of the BSN program in the College of Nursing, PIMS Islamabad, and I am also the course coordinator of the Anatomy and Physiology. Okay, in the lecture number session 2, we learned about the skull and the different parts of the skull, and what are the different bones which is take the parts in the formation of the cranium cavity. Today we go in this lecture, in the lecture number 3, we will go to learn more about the different type of the feature and the process and the fossa and the foramen which are present in the skull. Let's start from here in the occipital. If you see at the back side of the occipital, it's a protuberant over here, and this protuberant is called the occipital protuberant. In the occipital protuberant, we have the two type of the line over here. One is the superior and greater line, and the second one is a lesser and inferior line. This is called the superior nodular line. This one is called the superior nodular line, and this one is called the inferior nodular line. Okay. Now come up on the lateral side of the occipital, the sutures which is present between the occipital bones and the parietal bone. This is called the lumboid sutures. And the sutures which is present between the mastoid portion of the temporal bone. This is the mastoid process of the temporal bone, and this is the occipital. The sutures which is present between the mastoid process of the temporal bone and the occipital, this is called the occipito-mastoid sutures. Now let's see in the where the occipital bone and the mastoid process of the temporal bone are united with each other. It is become a trigon shape of the bone is present here, and this bone is called the Foramen sutures bone. The Foramen sutures bone. This bone, the part of the smallest bone, is made up by the sutures, between the sutures. Just as come of the front side of the this is a temporal bone on the lateral side of the skull. The temporal bone is again a four part. The flat portion of this temporal bone is called the squamous portion, and the sutures which is present between the squamous portion of the temporal bone and the parietal bone, this is called the squamous sutures. And the sutures which is present between the squamous portion of the temporal bone and the sphenoid bone, this is called the sphenoid sutures. Now you see in the back side of the squamous, the flat portion of the temporal bone, the back side is a process over here, and this process is called the mastoid process. This one, it is called the mastoid process. And just over the behind of the mastoid process is a spongy portion is here, and inside of this spongy portion is the mastoid sinuses over here. Just if you see at the interior superior of the mastoid process is a metis over here, is an opening in here. This is called the external oscitic metas canal. External oscitic metas canal means the air canal, external air canal. Just below of this is the external oscitic canal. Just below this one is a styloid process is here. This is called the styloid process. The styloid process of the temporal bone. In the styloid process of the temporal bone, the ligaments of the hyoid bone is attached over here. In the mastoid process, sternocleidomastoid muscles are attached over here. Okay, you see just see over here, just at the external meatus, at the front of the external meatus and in the temporal bone is a fossa is here, is a temporal fossa. is a temporal fossa. It is the condyle of the mandible bones will attach over here, is attached over here to make the temporomandibular joint. If you see the temporal bone is a process over here, and this process of the temporal bone will goes unite with the zygomatic bone, so it is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And the process of this zygomatic bone goes on the back side will goes to attach with the process of the temporal bone. This is called the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Now the situation which is present between the zygomatic process and the temporal process. This temporal process and zygomatic process, this is called the temporo-zygomatic sutures. Now this is the zygomatic, this is the temporal arch, and this is the temporal notch. At the just or the below, at the we will see at the base of the skull, in the inferior portion, we have the different type of the features and different type of the foramens over here. In the occipital, just below the lesser nostril line is a greater foramen is here, and this is foramen of the magnum. From this foramen of magnum, the spinal cord of the brain, the spinal cord will be passed through from it. Okay, just see at the front of the both side of the foramen magnum is a condyle who is over here. This is the condylar process of the occipital. This is the condylar process of the occipital. This condyle will goes to attach with the axis or the cervical vertebra to make the formations, to make the joints, the pivotal joints of the skull with the neck. Just see at the just below, just see here, just below of the condyle is a foramen is here, and this is called condylar foramen. This one, this is called hypocondylar foramen. This one, this is the condylar foramen, and this is called the hypoglossal foramen. This one is called the hypoglossal foramen. Here the hypoglossal nerve is passed through from it, and this one is the condylar foramen. Now just at the lateral side, just at the lateral side of the condyle is a big foramen is here. See, this is a big foramen is here, and this big foramen is called the jugular foramen, and the jugular vein, the jugular arteries will be passed from here. Just at the front of the jugular foramen, just at the front of the jugular foramen, another foramen is here, and this is called the external carotid foramen. This is the carotid foramen, this one. At the front of the at the interior side, at the front of the carotid foramen is another foramen is here. This is called the foramen of the spinosum. This is the spinosum foramen, this one, the spinosum foramen. At just on the front of the spinosum foramen is other foramen which is oval in shape. Just see here is an oval in shape. This is the oval foramen. At just on the medial of the oval foramen, on the medial side of the oval foramen is the other foramen is here, and this foramen is called the foramen of the random. Foramen of the random. Foramen of the random. Just another foramen is here. If you see, this is the mastoid process, and this is the styloid process. This is the mastoid process. This is styloid process of the temporal bone. This is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. Between of these, another foramen is here. This is called the stylomastoid foramen. This foramen which is present between the mastoid process and the styloid process of the temporal bone is called the stylomastoid foramen. Okay, let's come up on the middle portion of the base of the inferior side of the skull. If you see here, this is the hard palate. This is the hard palate. If you see, the hard palate is the central line is here. This is the sutures. This is called the central sutures. This one is called the central sutures of the palatine bone. And other sutures is present here, which is in a transverse way. The both hard palatine or the lower palatine is joined with this suture. This is called the transverse sutures. This one is called the transverse sutures. And this foramen is over here, just behind of the incisor teeth. This is called the incisor foramen, palatine foramen. Okay. Now let's see, if you are looking at just at the back side of the nasal cavity, just behind of the nasal cavity, you are looking, these are the two type of the process over here, and this is the major portion of the base of the skull is made by the sphenoid bone. Now the wing like the process of the structure is visualizing over here. This is called the pterygoid process. This is called the pterygoid process. The outer one is called the lateral pterygoid process, and the middle one is called the medial pterygoid process. The lateral pterygoid process and the medial pterygoid process. Between these both pterygoid process is a fossa here. This is called the tonsillar fossa here. The tonsils are located or situated over here. If you see, this is a conchae. This is the nasal conchae, the opening of the nasal cavity. In the between of the nasal cavity is a septum is here. If you are looking, there's a septum is there. This is the septum of the vomer bone. This is a septum of the vomer bone. And these are the notch is a nasopharyngeal notch. This one of between the vomer bone and the lesser pterygoid process is a nasopharyngeal notch. Okay. If we come off on the, let's see. In the front, this is the frontal bone. This is the one frontal bone, which is at the front side. The half of the frontal bone is made of the skull. The 2/3 and 1/3 is formulate the facial structure of the forehead. In the frontal bone, upper the frontal bone is a depression is there. This depression is called the glabella. And in the frontal bone, just above of the eye orbit is a depression is over here. This is called the glabella. If in the frontal bone, this frontal bone is make the upper border of the eye orbit. The upper border of the eye orbit. This is called the orbit ridge, superior orbit ridge. If you see at the superior border of the eyeball is a foramen is here. This is called the supraorbital foramen. Just of the below of the inferior border of the eyeball is another foramen. This is called the infraorbital foramen. Inferior orbital foramen. The eye orbit, how it is made up the eye orbit. The superior border of the eye orbit is made up by the frontal bone, and the lateral border of the eye orbit is made up by the zygomatic bone. The mostly of the lateral side of the eye orbit is made up by the zygomatic bone. The inferior border is made up by the inferior border of the eye orbit is made up by the zygomatic bone or the maxillary bone. And the medial and superior border is made up by the ethmoid and lacrimal bone. And the posterior border of the eye orbit is made up by the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid and the roof of the eye orbit is made up by the frontal bone. So it is all about the four borders of the eye orbit. If you see at the back of the eye orbit is a foramen is here, and this foramen which is you are looking at the posterior side of the eye orbit, this foramen is called the optic foramen. This is called the optic foramen. The optic nerve, the optic arteries and the optic vein is passed through from it. Just at the lateral side of the optic foramen you see is a fissure is here. The fissure like the canal like the fissure like structures over here. This is called the superior fissure, superior optic fissure. This is a superior optic fissure, and this is in the lower one, this is called the inferior optic fissure. This is superior optic fissure, this is the inferior optic fissure. And see in the nasal cavity, this nasal bridge is made up by the nasal bone. The nasal bridge is made up by the nasal bone, and the nasal bone, and the some school of thought says the nasal bone is the hardest bone in the human body. In the between of the nasal bone, the nasal cavity, you see is a septum is here. Is septum-like structures are looking here. This septum-like structure which is divide the nasal cavity in the two portions, this is called the vomer bone. If you see in the lateral side of the vomer bone is another bone are looking there. This is are the two nasal conchae, superior nasal conchae and inferior nasal conchae. The two nasal conchae are present here at the just at the both side of the vomer bone. This is called the superior nasal conchae and the inferior nasal conchae. These nasal conchae, superior nasal conchae, is make up the conchae inside the nasal cavity, which regulate the air and warm the air and humidification of the air just before to enter in the respiratory system. Okay, now this is the we just to go to then from the now see in the inside from the inside of the base of the skull, we have the different type of the fossas, and the features are over here. There are the three types of the fossas you are looking inside in the base of the skull. This is called the frontal fossa, and this is one the both side is ditch-like structure. This is called the medial fossa, and in the back side where is the foramen is magnum is present, this is called the occipital fossa. This one occipital fossa. The both side are the of the sphenoid bone is a ditch-like structure. This is called the medial fossa, and this one is called the occipital fossa. Is the frontal fossa, where the frontal fossa in the interior side, the frontal fossa is the frontal lobe is situated here. In the middle one is the middle portion of the parietal and temporal portions of the brain are located or situated over here, and this occipital fossa, the occipital lobe of the brain and the cerebellum are situated over here, and the brain stem as well. If you see, look at the front, in the frontal fossa is a crest-like structure. This is a crest-like structure, and this crest-like structure, this is a structure is the of the ethmoid bone, which is united with, which is are joined with the frontal bone from the superior portion of the nasal cavity. So the crest-like structure is called the cristoglia. This portion is called the cristoglia. At the both side of the cristoglia is a palate-like structure or groove-like structure. This is called the capriform. This is called the capriform palate. Inside of the capriform palate, you see the two opening are here, and these two opening is called the olfactory foramen, and the olfactory nerves are passed through from it. If you see here, this is the middle portion. The middle portion of the base of the skull is made up by the sphenoid bone, and the medial foramen is made up by the sphenoid bone. If you see over here, this is a wing-like structure of the sphenoid bone. This wing-like of structure, which is a lesser in shape, you see, this is a lesser in shape, and this called the lesser wing. This is a lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, and the just below of the lesser wing in the medial fossa is a greater wing. This is called the greater wing, and this one is called the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. Just at the base of the, you see, just at the base of the lesser wing is a foramen is here. And let's see, two type of the foramen are here, and this is foramen is called the optic foramen. The same one is the optic foramen, which is you are visualizing from the here, this one. Okay. Now see in the middle one portions, just below of this foramen is a fossa is here, and this fossa is called the hypophyseal fossa. This called the hypophyseal fossa. In this hypophyseal fossa is called the pituitary gland is located or situated over here or lying here. The pituitary gland is lying here in the hypophyseal fossa. This whole, the circular, this upper condyle, this interior condyle and the posterior condyle of the fossa, the whole area is called the sella turcica. This portion is called the sella turcica. This portion is called the sella turcica. Now see, the same foramen are looking here from the base of the skull. This is the oval foramen, this one, the oval foramen, and this is the carotid foramen, and this is the foramen of the random, this is the foramen of magnum, and this is a jugular foramen from which the jugular vein are passed through it, and this is the hypoglossal canal, hypoglossal foramen. And this is the bony projection, which is you are looking between the, which is divide the medial fossa and the occipital fossa. This is the Pterygoid process, or the Pterygoid portion of the temporal bone. And this is the one school of the thoughts of the anatomical said this portion of the temporal bone is the dense, highly dense portion of the bone inside the human body. Now, this condyle, the condyle of the mandible, this is the mandible bone. This is the mandible bone. The mandible bone have the three portions. The one portion is called the portion is a superior portion. This is called the ramus. This portion, the broader one, is called the ramus, and this portion is called the body of the mandible, and the broader portion is called the ramus. And we have the two condyle of the this is the condylar process of the mandible, which goes to unite with the temporal fossa of the temporal bone to make the temporomandibular joint, and this is called the Pterygoid process. This is the Pterygoid process of the mandible bone, and this is a notch over here. This is called the mandibular notch. This one is called the mandibular, and this broader portion of the mandible is called the ramus. And this is this angle over here between the body and the ramus is the angle is here. This is called the mandible angle, and this is the body of the foramen. And the foramen over here, this is the portion is called the mandibular body of the mandible. In the body of the mandible, at the front side is a foramen is here, and this foramen is called the mental foramen. This foramen is called the mental foramen. And the mental foramen, you see in the lower jaw is a groove over here, and this is called the tooth grooves. In the face, if you see this bone, this is a bone which is have the three process. The one process is called the frontal process. This is called the zygomatic bone, and the zygomatic bone is called the cheekbone. The cheekbone. The zygomatic bone have the three process. The superior process, which is will goes to unite with the frontal bone, this is called the frontal process. And the frontal process with the frontal bone make the frontozygomatic sutures. And in the posterior side of the zygomatic bone, another process is here, and this process is called the temporal process, because the portion of the zygomatic bone, this process will goes to unite with the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Now in the interior side, in the interior and medial side of the zygomatic bone is other process. This is called the maxillary process, because this process will goes to make the joints with the maxillary bone. Okay. This bone just below of the cheekbone, on the lateral side of the nasal cavity, and this is called the maxillary bone. And the maxillary bone mostly make the upper jaw. In the upper jaw, the maxillary bone, you see, is a groove over here, and these grooves are called the alveolar grooves. These grooves are called the alveolar grooves, and the process are called the alveolar process. And that it is a socket is here. This is a tooth socket, in which the tooth, different type of the tooth, the incisor, the canine, the premolar and molars are attached over here. And these the teeth which is attached on the upper jaw and the lower jaw and the maxillary bone and the mandible bone, they make the ball and socket joint. And the ball and socket joint is a type of the fibrous connective tissue joint. And the fibrous connective tissue joints are the immovable joint, is a type of the immovable joint. I hope this is all about the main features. We learned about the anatomy of the whole of the skulls and the cranium portions, the cranium bones, which is make the cranial cavity, which is make the first portion of the cranium is called the neurocranium portions. And neurocranium portions of the skulls mostly made up by the flat bone, and this is a consist of the 8 bone. This is a makeup of the 8 bone: the frontal bone, the parietal bone, occipital bone, temporal bone, and sphenoid bone, and ethmoid bone, and the sphenoid bone, ethmoid bone, and the frontal bone, parietal bone, occipital bone. So, and the other portion of, we learned the other portion of the skull is called the viscerocranium. The viscerocranium is make the base of the skull, the base of the skull. The neurocranium portion of the skull mostly give the coverage and make the cranial cavity, and give the house or a place, house and the place for the brain. Now in the viscerocranium portions, the mostly is the portion of the skull is made up by the viscerocranium portion. In the viscerocranium portion is made up by the 14 irregular bones. Mostly are made up by the facial bones. in which the oral cavity, nasal cavity, eye orbit, and the ears, and then the lower jaw is present inside the viscerocranium cavity. I hope you have learned a lot from the today's session about the skull. If you have any type of the queries or any questions, you can email me. Yeah, you can comments in my inbox of my YouTube channel. Then I will reply it. Thank you.